Hair scrunchies. These fun knitted projects are perfect for beginners, and they will only take about a weekend or an evening to complete. They're really fun to make a bunch for gifts or for yourself, and the best part is you can use your scrap yarn to complete them. So let's learn how to do these fun scrunchies together. Hello knitting friends, and welcome back to Jack Knits. Today we're going to learn how to do these fun hair scrunchies. Now this scrunchie doesn't require a whole lot of knitting skills, just how to do the basic knit stitch, casting on, binding off. I do have videos on each of those methods below that you can follow along with first. But one thing that we are going to learn how to do today is learn how to knit in the round to make these knitted scrunchies. Now if you've never knitted in the round before, please do not fret. It is not difficult to do, and I will show you exactly how to do it. If you would, however, prefer to knit these flat using regular straight needles, you can do that. You'll just have to make sure that you are following along to make the stockinette stitching when you're knitting flat, which means knitting one row, purling the next, and then at the end of your knitting rows and after you bind off, you will need to do an additional seam down the side to make it into a tubular knitting structure, which is what we're going to accomplish when we knit in the round. But I am going to show you how to do this pattern by knitting in the round. So let's get started by taking a look at the materials that we're going to need for this project. I have chosen a cotton weight yarn, a worsted weight cotton yarn. Thought that would be really pretty for this scrunchie, but you can really use any weight yarn or any type of yarn for this. If you use a heavier weight yarn, just cast on fewer stitches and knit fewer rows. If you are using a lighter weight yarn, cast on more stitches and knit more rows. But for this particular scrunchie that I will do, I will use this cotton worsted weight yarn. Then for the needle, again, I'm going to use this round needle for knitting in the round. It is a US size 5 needle and it is 16 inches long. It will be just the right size to fit our stitches for this project. Then for knitting in the round, I like to use a stitch marker to place at the beginning of each round. It helps for counting how many rows that we have accomplished in our knitting project. Then at the end, we are going to wrap our knitting pattern around this knit tie, so you will need a knit tie for that. I found that a safety pin is helpful to knit it, to hold it in place when I'm doing that, and then a darning needle for that seaming around that knit tie. And scissors is always handy to have as well. So let's get started by casting on our stitches to the needle. Now I'm going to use a long tail cast on method. If you need a refresher on that, I have a video on that below. You can watch that first and remind yourself how to do the long tail cast on. But I'm going to start by kind of giving myself a big long tail for this, for 60 stitches. I think that should be good. And I will begin by casting on 60 stitches. So I will do that. I will pause the video a bit while I do these cast on stitches, and I will see you back after I have completed that step. We'll see you in a moment. Okay, now that I've casted on my 60 stitches, let's begin by joining the stitches to work in a round. So what you want to do when you have your cast on stitches on your round needle is set it down on a flat surface like I've done here, and kind of scooch your stitches around so they kind of cover the whole circumference of the circle. And then the second thing you want to look for is to make sure that all this cast on ridge that you see here all the way around is pointing towards the center of the circle. See how I have that on the center? I don't have any stitches that are twisted over like this. It's all pointing to the center of the circle. So that's what you want it to look like before you start to knit in the round. So to start, we are going to first also make sure that our yarn from our working ball of yarn and our tail is on this right side of the circle, and the blank without the tail and the working yarn is on your left, because we are going to start to knit this way using this needle for our right side and this as our left. So we're going to begin by just working with our first stitch. Make sure you do not use your tail from your cast on, but use your working yarn. And we will start by just knitting that first stitch and kind of pulling it tight to the other needle. Now we have just basically joined our knitting So we can now begin to continue to knit and knit in the round. So from then on, you just really basically just continue to knit this first row of stitches. Now you're going to find that these stitches, if you don't have a lot of stitches on your needle, it feels very tight. So you're going to want to keep moving them from the right, spinning them over to the left side so you can work those stitches. Now after you've knitted a few rows, you're going to gain some more volume in those stitches and it won't feel as tight. So these first few rows feel kind of awkward and tight across your circular needles, but that will get better in a few rounds. So that's basically just how you start with your knitting in the round, and from now on we are just going to knit every single stitch. Because we're working in the round, the knitted side of the fabric is always going to be facing us. So to get the stockinette stitch look, which is what this is on this scrunchie, where you see the nice knitted side of the fabric, we are only needing to knit because that knit side is towards us. Now if you are working this in the flat, you would need to knit the first row, the odd number of rows, and purl the next row and all the even number of rows to achieve that stockinette look. But that's the beauty of knitting in the round. We do not have to do any purl stitches. So let's continue to knit. I'm going to knit to the end of this row, or to the end of this round, and then I will touch back with you and we'll see how we can continue to knit after we've finished that first round of knitting. Okay, I have knitted all the way to the end of my round, and I know that because the tail from my cast on is now at the last stitch that I stitched. So now for knitting in the round, I want to put a little stitch marker right here, and this will just indicate the start and end of each round. It makes for a little bit easier of counting how many rounds I have completed to know how far I am in my project. Or if you're following any other pattern, obviously if you finished one round, you would follow the instructions on what to do for round 2, 3, 4, etc. So now when you knit in the round, what you do after ending every first round is really just keep knitting, which is really the beauty. One of the beauties of knitting in the round is that you don't have to keep going back and switching your needles back and forth. You can just keep knitting without changing your knitting. And as I mentioned earlier, for a stockinette stitch effect, you knit every round. You do not need to do any purling. Okay, so I will again pause the video and continue to knit. If you want to follow along, just continue to knit. Keep knitting in the round. I'm going to knit about I'm thinking 20 rows will make it for a nice size scrunchie. So we'll take a look after 20 rows and see how that looks. So I will do a little knitting and I will be right back after I've completed about 20 rows. See you in a moment. Okay, well I've knitted the number of rows that I wanted to knit for this knit scrunchie. I've knitted 20 rounds of knitting in the round, and I think this is about the right length that we want for the scrunchie. You can kind of check if you fold it under halfway like this, that's how wide the scrunchie will be. So I think that's a good width. If you want it to be a little bit of a narrow or smaller scrunchie, just knit fewer rounds in your knitting. Okay, so now we're going to be ready to bind off. I am at the end of the round here as indicated by stitch markers. I'm just going to remove that. And if you need a refresher, full refresher on binding off, you can refer to my video in the description below on bind off. But we don't need any fancy bind off. We're just going to use a regular bind off. It doesn't need to be a special stretchy one at all. So we're just going to do a regular bind off, which means to knit one, knit a second one, and then I'm going to pick up the first stitch that I knitted and bring it over that second stitch. And I have bound off one stitch. So I'm going to do that again. Bind off another one. And I'll continue with this fashion of knitting one and passing the first knitted stitch over the second, and continue that all the way around. So this is the bind off part of the project, and I will see you when I have finished all my bind off stitches. Okay, so now that I have bounded off all my stitches, I had pulled the last stitch through and I gave myself a really long tail because this is the edge, the tail that I am going to use to weave around my stitches. So to begin with, I want to take my tail from my cast on, and I don't want that to get in my way when I'm doing the seaming, so I'm just going to get rid of that tail by weaving it into the inside here, just up and down a couple rows, and that way that won't interfere with our seaming. So I'm going to just do a little weave in here and snip that off. Okay, so now that won't bother me. Now let's take our knitting here and we're going to turn it inside out. Okay, with our big long tail at the top and our little cast on stubby tail there at the end. Now let's take our tie, our hair tie, and we want to insert it into the center of our knitting here. And I'm just going to take a safety pin and secure that into place, but do it from the right side of your knitting so you'll be able to easily remove it later. And this is just to keep the hair tie in place as we seam around. Now let's take the inside and we're going to bring it through that hair tie loop, bring it up to this edge. And this is the edge that we are going to start knitting or seaming all the way around, okay? So let's take this edge and thread it through our darning needle. We got a nice long thread there. And I'm going to take this edge here, see this long row of knitting stitches with the V's all pointing down? This is going to be the very first stitch I'm going to pick up with my knitting. Well, actually, I'm going to pick it up on this side because this is where my tail is coming out. So let's look at this side first. Here we go. See this row of knitting with the V's all pointing down? So this stitch, I don't want this very top one that's kind of disappearing into the edge. I want this next full stitch that you can see, my full V that is like this. I want that V right there, and I'm going to stick my needle through both of those legs of the V, pull my yarn through. Now on the other side, I'm going to take the corresponding line of stitches, but with the V's pointing down towards the stitch, and take that last full one that I see, very last full one that I see, pick up both of those legs, put my needle through, and pull it through. Okay, now you don't have to pull it too tight yet. We are going to keep it snug in just a minute, and but we're going to do a few stitches. Okay, so that was the last V that I picked up. Now the next row of V's is right here. And I'm going to pick up this one right here. Not the very one that you could hardly see the full one, but the one that you can see the full V. And pick that up. And thread that through. Same on the other side. You can see that this was the last V I did here. You can kind of see my stitch. So this next V is what we want to pick up. And again, you want to make sure you go through both of those threads. You also want to make sure you're not splitting your yarn at all, not picking up only a portion of it, but picking up that full thread and going through both of those V's. And pulling that. Okay, and here is my next V, right? That was the last one I did. Here's my next one. Both threads. Let's do a couple more, and then I'm going to show you how when you can kind of pull it snug, and then let it disappear. Here's my next V right here. Okay, now you can see that obviously you're still seeing all your stitches, and you're wondering, well, how is that an invisible seam? But if I take this and now just give it a nice gentle pull, I can see that those seam stitches are now kind of disappearing in there. So let's now continue on with our next row. If you need to kind of separate that a little bit so you can kind of see where you were. So here's where that last stitch came out of. So I'm now on this side with that V right here, and we'll take that. Next side, here's that V with the V's pointing down. And as I'm scooching around, I'm kind of scooching my hair tie and scooching my fabric in so it always goes in between that hair tie. And here's my next V I want to pick up. And the other side. So I'm just going to continue in this fashion all the way around. I'll swing by around halfway through so you can kind of see what it looks like when we're about halfway down, and then we'll finish it up. Okay, see you in a little bit. All right, so I am continuing to run my mattress stitch around my hair tie by connecting these two together. I'm about halfway done. You can see that it's starting to get really nice and gathered here for that scrunchie. So I'm just continuing in that fashion, pulling the V's from one side and the corresponding V from the other side. And every few stitches or so, just giving it a nice little tug to hide those stitches and make it a seamless stitch. So I will continue again, and I will meet you at the end where we will just finish it up and take a look at our finished product. We'll see you in a bit. Okay, I have finished seaming all the way around the edge. I can now remove the safety pin because obviously my hair tie is secure inside there. And now I'm just going to finish it off by kind of getting rid of this last little stitch and bump here. I'm just going to pull in that, kind of connect those two one more time. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of stick my needle in that little tail bump that we see and kind of stick it inside the scrunchie, come out a little ways so I can kind of pull that end in snug. Okay, and there we go. Now that all that's left is to take my tail here and weave it in. I'm just going to weave it in kind of in the seam on top. Picking up a couple of those stitches, pulling it through, and back again. And we'll snip it off here at the end. And there we go. A very fun scrunchie, very easy to do. Probably the most time consuming is the seaming at the end. But if you're comfortable with doing a little needlework, this is a fun, easy project to do. So hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found this helpful. If so, please like and don't forget to subscribe. You'll receive notifications of new videos all about knitting tips and tutorials and creative patterns like these fun scrunchy hair ties. So thanks for watching. Happy knitting, everyone.